This is an overview about survey research method. My name is Jovina. Let's get started. In this quantitative research method class, we will be discussing about survey and experimental research. So what are actually the differences between these two approaches, survey and experimental research? So let's first think about the following graphs. So the first graph shows the correlation between the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. The correlation index, the R, equals to 0.67, and this is quite a high correlation in social science. So this means that the more films Nicolas Cage appeared in that year, the more people drowned by falling into a pool. What can we infer from this correlation? The second graph shows the correlation between per capita cheese consumption and the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. The R coefficient equals to 0.95. This is pretty high correlation. It's almost a perfect correlation between the two variables. What should we conclude? Should we stop eating cheese? Next graph shows the correlation between the age of Miss America and the murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. You can see that the R here is 0.87. It's also pretty high correlations between the two variables. What should we do with this? Should we limit the age of Miss America? Should we just not let anyone older than 18 years old to be Miss America? So it's probably the good news. This is the correlation between per capita consumption of mozzarella cheese and the civil engineering doctorates awarded in that year. The correlation is also pretty high. It's around 0.96. So maybe, I'm not sure, should we eat more cheese or should we not eat more cheese? Another graph shows the correlation between people who drown after falling out of a fishing boat and the marriage rate in Kentucky. The R index or coefficient is also very high, 0.95. Should we tell people of Kentucky to stop getting married? So these are at least three differences between survey and experimental approaches in research. The first and the most important thing that I would like to emphasize is that correlation does not necessarily mean causation, as what we saw in the graphs, in the previous graphs, in the previous slides, that 2, 3, 4 things or more might be correlated pretty high with each other, but without experimental research, we cannot be sure whether those correlations have causational correlation. We don't know which one is the cause and which one is the effect. But another thing that I wanted to emphasize is the role of theory, because in the graphs in the previous slides, they were not founded based on any theories, right? So it was just spurious correlation from any data. They were just trying to show that we can, if we want to analyze things statistically, we can, but the main point is that it has to be based on certain theory to be able to do scientific research. The next one is that there's no variable manipulation in survey research. We're just measuring our independent variable and our dependent variable. And there are some survey research that actually only has one variable, for example, that the people's behavior during the pandemic. We just do the survey about their behaviors and that's all. Just want to describe. That's kind of like exploratory research. And that's also a type of survey that we can do. But there's no variable manipulation, and so that's why we cannot infer any causational correlation between the 2 or 3 variables or how many variables we want to explain. And because of lack of ability of controlling the variables, the extraneous variables, the survey research has lower internal validity compared to the experimental research. In experimental research, we are trying to control even the situations in most of the time in laboratory settings. But in survey research, most of the data are only based on self-report, and now in this virtual time, in this era, we do so many online surveys. So people can just do the surveys at home, and we cannot even control how or when or where they're filling out the questionnaires and everything. So we cannot control even the situation or the settings. So there might be other more extraneous variables that affect the results of the study in survey compared to the experimental research. There are several characteristics of survey research. First, yes, it has to follow a systematic method. So we have to have a procedure of data collection. Why? Why we need a systematic method? Uh, to be called scientific, we have to follow systematic procedure so that you remember the one of the criteria or characteristic of scientific research is replicability, right? So when we are following a systematic procedure, then other researchers in the future, they will be able also to follow the same procedure to replicate our research. Yeah, maybe in different settings or with different populations or with different samples. The next one is we're using quantitative data for survey research. Even when we're doing sort of a mixed method, when we have like open-ended questionnaire and our participants basically answered or responded in verbal responses when they're writing something, like not in numbers, we will still quantify try to quantify their responses. But typically, we will have a specific or a set of predetermined questions. And even in our options, in the options like agree to disagree, we will quantify it, right? So, for example, agree, we will code it into 4, and then disagree, code it into 1 or something like that. It involves selecting a sample. Yeah, so we will have to select a particular sample from a particular specific populations in our research. And as I said, we use a predetermined set of questions. So it's not like, questions that we just develop right now, and then we just ask the questions to people, and then we will have a different set of questions for one specific person to another. No, we have a predetermined set of questions. So we have to develop some questionnaires first, before we collect the data. And survey research can be used in exploratory, descriptive, predictive, and in some cases, explanatory research. But most of typical of survey research, it does not really have the ability to explain because there's no causational effect. But in some cases, we might be able to use survey research for explanatory research. For example, when there is already, for example, there's an earthquake in a particular place, and then we want to measure the mental health, of the victims of whether the secondary victims of the earthquake, for example. Then we explain the results using the situations, the conditions that, oh yeah, there was just an earthquake there, so that's why probably they have some problems, some issues with their mental health, something like that. There are several uses of surveys. The first one is for sure assessing people's thoughts, opinions, and feelings. We can just ask questions, asking their opinions, asking their thoughts about something, attitudes about something, and even emotions, like what are their feelings about a certain topic, or even you can ask, what do you feel right now? Something like that. It can be specific and limited in scope or more global in their goals. It depends on your research goals, whether you want it to be very specific or very broad. And the best way to determine whether results of a survey are biased is to examine the survey procedures and analysis. So that's why you really have to have a very systematic procedure so that other researchers can also evaluate whether your research is biased or it's objective. These are the steps in survey research. So first, for sure, you'll have to make a plan and design your research. We will talk about problem definition and hypothesis later. But yes, you have to have a specific plan, even data collection plan, after designing your research. And you have to construct and refine the instruments. Yeah, you have to construct the questionnaires. Even when you already have questionnaires from previous researchers or previous research, then you first, maybe you will have to do like adaptation. Yeah, so maybe questionnaire adaptation, maybe from different language to our language. Or you might need to refine the instruments or the measures based on the context. Maybe the previous research used the scale or the measures in another setting or in another culture, but it may not be it may not be easy to be understood in our context with our language. So we might have to refine that instrument. And after we use it once, the second one, maybe we will need to revise and revise again. After we have the measures, we can collect the data using those measures, yeah, the instruments, the scales, yeah, or the questionnaires. Once we get the data, we can enter the data into Excel sheet, SPSS, or other software, statistical software that we're familiar with, and also clean the data. Nowadays, though, when we're doing online survey, it's getting a bit easier. Yeah, we don't need to enter the data manually because everything is recorded in our computer. So that makes things easier, but we still need to sort of look at the data, and perhaps we need to clean the data as well. And I will talk about cleaning the data later in this class. After we have a clean data, we can analyze it, and after analyze the data, we need to make interpretation or a conclusion of the result and report it. Because if we just do research without reporting it, then what's the use of it? There are two types of survey research. The first one is cross-sectional, and the second one is longitudinal. These are the differences between the two. The cross-sectional is conducted at one time, single and brief time period. So what you're going to do in this class is doing a cross-sectional research. Longitudinal is collected at more than one point in time. So for example, you collect data from someone who is 18 years old right now, and then you collect data from that same person when he or she is 28, and then again and for another 10 years, so 18 years old, and then 28 years old, and then 38 years old, with the same person or the same group of participants, the same sample group. Yeah, so you're conducting research to the same participants, but across times. Cross-sectional the data is collected only once, but for longitudinal, it's kind of like long-term studies. Some longitudinal study is conducted, in 40 years, 100. I'm not sure if there is already a 100-year study yet, but one of the example of longitudinal study is IFLS. It's the Indonesian Family Life Survey. I believe it's been done since the 1997 or in the 90s. Yeah, so and 1997, I think it was done again in 2003 and then maybe 2007. Um, so, like, and they were following the same participants, the same families in across areas in Indonesia. And for the cross-sectional, yeah, we can collect data from multiple groups or types of people at one time. So for example, you're collecting data from someone who is in in elementary school. At the same time, you're doing survey of with the same topic, yeah, it's the same instruments. At the same time, you're also collecting data from someone who is in the middle school or secondary school, and then high school, and then college, and then master student, something like that, or someone who is in the you're collecting data from different lifespan, yeah, from like a child to adolescence to young adult, yeah, and etc. For the longitudinal, there's no cohort effect, so there's no you're collecting data um, with that same group of participants, but you're following them across the lifespan, right? So you might start the data collection when they were in elementary school, and then you again collect data when they were in the high school, and so on. So what is cohort effect? Cohort effect is the generational effect. So the limitation of cross-sectional study is that when you're trying to collect data right now, at one point from different generation, yeah, for example, right now, if you want to study about internet use, yeah, the millennial generation would be, because they were born with the computer, and with the computer, like they were born with technology. They're more familiar with technology. Yeah, so it will be, if you use if the variable is the internet use, then there will be something, that the familiarity of the internet will affect the data if you compare the millennial generations with the previous generation, for example. Yeah, for the longitudinal, there's no cohort effect because you're just following the same group of participants. So they are from the same generations, basically. So if you're studying the millennial generations 10 years ago, and then now, and then 10 years later, they are all in the same generational group. So there's no cohort effect. Their familiarity of internet will be at least similar. But of course, longitudinal will be time consuming. Yeah, you cannot, for doing undergraduate thesis, you cannot do like 10 years of research or 40 years of research, right? So the one thing that we can do is doing cross-sectional research. So this is an example of cross-sectional and longitudinal study. For the cross-sectional, you probably want to compare cognitive ability between children, adolescents, adults, and the elderly right now at the current time. But for the longitudinal, you will measure the cognitive development since they were childhood to the old age. Another example of cross-sectional and longitudinal studies is that when in cross-sectional, if you want to compare, if you want to see the development of prejudice across lifespan, then you will compare the stage of prejudice to different groups between kindergarten, elementary school, and junior high students, for example. For the longitudinal, you would follow them. You would measure prejudice development from childhood to pre-adolescence. These are some issues in designing a survey research that we will also cover in this class. What are the objectives? So yeah, normally, typically we will be thinking about what are the objectives of our research and who is the target population. This will be also depending on the objectives and also the hypothesis. And then which design, yeah, again, it depends on our answers to the previous questions. Which sampling method, how big is the sample? Should it be very big? Should it be 200 or should it be only 20 or 30? Which instruments should we use? The previous ones that was used by previous researchers or construct new ones? And which data collection method should we use? Should we use online survey? Should we use paper and pencil? At this point, though, we sort of have no other options besides the online survey. But actually, thank God that we have this option at this point. Who collect the data is also important issue in designing a survey research. And what is the time frame? So we will be talking about this across the semester in this class. So I'll see you again in discussing another topics in this class. Thank you.